So we're going to reconvene for our next panel. This panel is going to pick up where Bopa so adroitly left off, which is fundamentally, what should the U.S. do? What is the U.S. getting right? What is the U.S. getting wrong? And in that sense is a full circle return to the beginning of our day. We couldn't be in better hands to guide us through that discussion in the form of Professor Bill Alford. Bill is a faculty member here for many decades in the law school. He's also been the faculty chair and director of the East Asia Legal Studies program. You know, I think he holds a special place in the heart of generations of China specialists. He taught me, and he taught, I think, most of us who hang around and are denizens of both Cambridge, Beijing, Shanghai, many other cities in the world. And I found that his unique approach to not just obviously simply the issue of the law, but also the ways in which the party and the government interact with the law and how the law is a mechanism for shaping society. So we are in great hands with Professor Alford, and he will also in turn, since he knows the speakers so well, he will introduce the panelists. So Bill, thanks again for doing this, and over to you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. And I also very quickly want to thank Mark and Tony and Orville and Susan, Mary Kay, Dinda, and probably loads of other people for organizing this. And also, since we're the last panel of the day, for giving me such wonderful, illuminating panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, but first would note they all have extensive firsthand experience in China, albeit mostly pre-pandemic. So Jude Lancet over here holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC, but that title really doesn't capture fully how influential his ideas are, what a terrific analyst he is of China. His 2019 book, China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong, is really sharp-eyed and very prescient, almost depressingly prescient in some ways, about political life, and he writes for many popular media as well. Melanie Hart is senior advisor to the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy and Environment, in which role she serves as China policy coordinator for a host of extremely important issues at the nexus of foreign economic policy, including working with our allies on rewiring supply chains. And she's also played a very prominent lead role in semiconductor policy and implementing the department's so-called CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act, which you've all read about, sort of a response in part to China. Bob Ross, next to me, is an old friend who is professor of political science at Boston College, a fellow here at the Harvard Fairbank Center. He's taught at Columbia, where he earned his PhD in the University of Washington. His books, many books, include China's security policy. Columbia, yeah, Columbia. Said one. Oh, you taught also. I taught there. I'm sorry. Yes. PhD at Columbia, where he taught also. Bob and I are both getting older. Yes. At least I am. Bob's books include China's security policy structure, power and politics, China's ascent, power, security, and the future of international politics, and others. He's also a very keen observer of the PRC. And our fourth panelist is my old friend Orville Schell, and he's had an extraordinary and varied career. At present, he's the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. But he's done all kinds of amazing things earlier in his life that I think inform who he is. He was Dean of the School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was an immensely creative dean. He's been the recipient of Emmy, DuPont, and Peabody Awards for his work producing documentaries. That's pretty cool. And he was the co-founder of the Pacific News Service back in the day, as we like to say, those of us from the 60s, in the day. Also the Neiman Cattle Ranch, if you ever want to eat healthy beef. And last year he published a novel, My Old Home, a novel of exile. So pretty cool. So our format is, in the next 25 to 30 minutes, we will engage in conversation, and then we want to open the floor to all of you to ask questions. Now, our panel is intended cleverly, it's not my doing, but the organizers, to look ahead to the future. But I can't resist starting with a few questions that look back, partly at the recent history and partly at what we've heard today. And so I want to start with Melanie, if I might. So Melanie, we heard a lot about the, as mentioned before, Melanie is in the administration. We heard a lot today about the administration, different views. I think the panel with Joe Nye and Jessica Chen Weiss offered one take. Mark Wu's panel offered a slightly different take. I wonder, first question to you, how do you respond to this? What would you like to, if anything, take issue with? Where do you situate yourself?
Sure. So thank you. And thanks for having me. Really glad to be here today. I think one thing, as China experts, a lot of us, myself included, have spent decades traveling to China, building relationships there, really investing in the US-China relationship. And so it's really hard to see that relationship take a difficult turn. And so I completely understand the disappointment that people feel and the grief that a lot of us feel when right now it's very hard to travel to China. We don't have those kind of feel good elements of the relationship to point to, to feel like all of us are being successful. That's really hard. So I totally understand and empathize with that feeling of frustration and welcome criticism of everything that we're doing within the administration. One thing about the United States, this is an open system. We work for you and we welcome your criticism and how we're handling all manner of policy, including China policy. But one thing I really wanted to highlight as I was listening to some of the conversations earlier, it takes two to tango. And we have to deal with the China we've got. We have to deal with the Xi Jinping, the PRC government that we have at this point in time. As policymakers, our job is to be realistic. Our job is to deliver results for you, for the American people. And it's a responsibility. And I wanted to make clear, I think that at least in the conversation earlier today, there was a lot of focus on the pushback elements of the US strategy, the export controls, the areas, the human rights, the areas in which we are taking resolute action to defend US national interests, defend US national security, and uphold American values. We will continue to do that because that is our duty to the American people. What's missed is we are also keeping that door open to collaboration with the PRC and actively seeking it. There haven't been big moments of pomp and circumstance to celebrate that collaboration because we haven't gotten much back yet, but we continue to try. And I just wanted to give a couple of concrete examples. I think I really appreciated Andrew Erickson's comment earlier today. Let's be concrete and precise. At this moment in US-China relations, there's a lot of bombast. There can be a lot of, it's horrible, it's wonderful. And so I think being concrete is really important. And I wanted to provide two concrete areas where we are actively seeking PRC collaboration so that we can work together on the global stage. That's climate and food security. On the climate front, last November, we worked with China to sign the Glasgow Declaration on Enhancing Climate Action in 2020. That focuses on three areas: methane abatement, reducing coal consumption, and reducing illegal deforestation. The United States has proposed to Beijing specific actions that we can take to make progress on those areas. Beijing has promised to deliver a national action plan on methane abatement. China's 2020 or 2030 and 2060 climate targets do not cover methane, despite the fact that the climate warming impact of China's methane emissions surpass the climate warming impact of US CO2 emissions. So we need to do something about methane. That's why we signed the Glasgow Declaration with China. So far, there hasn't been any concrete action there. China's promised a national action plan on methane this year. We are waiting to see it. If it's a strong plan, then hopefully we will have something to celebrate. But that is concrete. We have to deliver real action on that issue. It was very unfortunate that Beijing cut off climate engagement after August of this year. Great that the presidential visit seems to have restarted that, but we need to see action going forward. As policymakers, we have to focus on that. And then, one other example, food security. In May, the United States introduced a roadmap for global food security in the United Nations that calls for nations to contribute to humanitarian organizations, keep markets open, not put export bans on food or fertilizer, share market data, and invest in long-term agricultural production so that we can support the food security crisis triggered by Russia's war of choice in Ukraine. Over 100 nations have signed on. Beijing has not. Instead, we face with Beijing trade restrictions on fertilizer, hoarding grain, not sharing data, which would be very helpful for reassuring markets. Those are very concrete things. We continue to engage. I'm hopeful. It would be wonderful to have China sign on to this broad initiative that's in global interest. These are the kinds of things that we are pursuing. If we get good progress, then we will get those good moments. But those good moments will have to be based on action and concrete measurable progress.
Thanks, Melanie. Now, Orville, Melanie said it takes two to tango. And when we were communicating before, you said you might want to ruminate how you thought there might be a possibility given the failures of the zero COVID policy and trade conflict and the sort of ways in which some non-aligned countries were reacting to the shrillness of the wolf warrior approach. There might be some possibility of Xi Jinping sort of becoming a little more accommodationist, a little more receptive, understanding the need for the West. So I wonder if in that light, you would engage with what Melanie just had to say.
Yes, well, it's great to be here with you all, and thanks, Bill, for wrangling this group. I think Melanie really went to the heart of the matter when she said that it really, it's essential that we have two parties to get anything done in this standoff. We do not suffer from a deficit of common interest. What we suffer from is a lack of reciprocity. And I think, Melanie, you also said, and I concur, that we all are feeling a little bit triste at the situation in which we find ourselves, because we all, I think almost everyone in this room, it would be fair to say, is a child of engagement. And what is engagement? What was, I should say, engagement? It really was, what's the title here? Coexistence 2.0. Why are we renaming it? We're wistfully looking back to the era where there was not only an actual supply of common interest, but we were capable, even as we had major disagreements, and we've had some whoppers over the last decades, but of working together sufficiently enough that we could slowly build up musculature between the two countries. And that has ended. And I think we have to really ask ourselves, why did it end? Americans have many faults, and our government has many weaknesses, and God knows, I don't know, we need to go through the litany of reasons why we should lament our failures and our weaknesses. However, there is one strength that I think Americans and Joe Biden, in his curious avuncular way, I forget, was it you, Andrew, that said it? Yes, you did. I've been on 2 trips with Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And I have to say, there is no human being on earth capable of melting the likes of Xi Jinping with his Mona Lisa-like smile and non-revealing mien than Joe Biden. I mean, he comes up and slaps you on the back and gives you a big hug and big grin on his face. You know, I've never seen Xi Jinping grin back at Biden. And I thought one of the great failures of the Biden administration was not appointing, the Obama administration was not appointing Biden Mr. China. If I had been Biden, I would have said to Biden, go to Beijing, don't come back until you get a deal, a better deal than the one we had. He didn't do it. I mean, and Obama was, you know, he was Obama. So I think that this is really, there's a tragedy here that we've, for reasons which I think do have a great deal to do with Xi Jinping's nature and his deep suspiciousness, which is a current that has flowed throughout Chinese contemporary history. You remember when John Foster Dulles back in the 1950s said, well, if we can't get them by, I paraphrase here, hot war, we'll get them by, well, the Chinese called it peaceful evolution. You know, we'll just sort of slowly peck away at them culturally, politically, and soft power, et cetera, et cetera. And there's always been this deep, abiding distrust that what America was trying to do to China was to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party one way or another, and engagement was just another way to do that. Engagement was going to just sort of hug them to death, trade with them to death, send so many ballet troops to China that China would just surrender, but it didn't work. And the great mystery to me, having spent my whole life following the sort of evolution of China, is what happened? Because I don't think we're going to be able to put this thing back together again until we figure out why the earlier version of Coexistence 2.0 went over the edge. And I think, frankly speaking, it went over the edge for the reasons that I've just only lightly alluded to. Just the way the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Xi Jinping, approaches the United States. Deep distrust, deep paranoia. And here he has supped from the wellspring of Chairman Mao, who saw enemies everywhere, whose whole notion of sort of the philosophical construct of the world was contradictions. And what was that theory about? He saw two kinds of contradictions. One was contradictions among the people, and they could be solved by debate and discussion and whatnot. The other was antagonistic contradictions, and I think, alas, this is the way Xi Jinping looks at the United States. And I'd be damned if I know what to do about it. Because in a climate like that, every approach just seems to be another way to subvert the People's Republic of China and overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's civil society or whatever. So those are some cheerful thoughts, and I think I'll stop here.
Well, I can't let you escape that easily, or all that optimism. You intimated before that it might be perceived by Xi Jinping that it was in his interest, not out of kindness or morality or generosity, but just self-interest of preservation, to be a little more accommodations. The real estate market is tanking, all the other issues I mentioned. Do you still hold that view?
My view is I'm always hopeful, and I think one of the great strengths of this country, when it is strong and smart, is to keep the door open and aggressively keep. And I think the Biden administration is doing this, trying to curry possibilities. And I think it is conceivable that Xi Jinping could arrive at the point where, for one reason or another, a feeling of weakness or vulnerability, he would want to change course. But I have to say, I went to China when Mao Zedong was still alive. I went on the trip with Deng Xiaoping. I've been on all these trips with presidents, watching the leaders. And I mean, Hu Yaobang was a kind of a wondrous character, actually, when you look back on it. And then Zhao Ziyang, I remember an interview he did with Tom Brokaw in 1986, and he sat there with a little table and a bottle of beer on the table, and he was talking to Tom Brokaw as if he was his uncle. Inconceivable now. I remember Jiang Zemin when Clinton arrived at the Great Hall of the People and went in, and it was announced they were going to broadcast this thing live over radio and television. And Jiang Zemin and Clinton got going like two vaudeville actors. It was incredible. They enjoyed each other's company. They wanted to be together. Jiang Zemin didn't want to be a strange leader like Kim Jong-il. He wanted to run with the big guys, and on and on and on. And I don't feel that emanating from Xi Jinping.
So let me turn to Jude, who has studied so carefully how the party works. So Jude, as you look back at the Arshada, do you see any signs whatsoever of on which we could build? You know, again, Orville trying to look to the future, or just structurally and in terms of Xi Jinping's personality, we're sort of at deadlock.
Hello. Can I first just give a couple thoughts building on what Orville just said? And it's fitting from your vantage point that I'm on the left and Orville's on the right, because I'm going to give some maybe sort of dovish remarks to his, some leftist remarks to his, rightist remarks on the relationship. I mean, one is, I understand what we mean when we say engagement is dead, but engagement isn't dead, of course. And I think we just have to look at the state of the bilateral relationship comprehensively to see we're still very, very, very much engaged with China. So there's this strong thread of buyer's remorse here in the United States on the bilateral relationship. And I think there's key elements that I can completely understand. But I also think we have to recognize that both as a descriptive matter of the state of economic, trade, cultural, technological ties, we're very much engaged, even if that engagement is atrophying relative to where it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. The other is we are engaged with China just by virtue of the physical realities of the world. There are viral realities, there are ecological realities, physical realities that make us in perpetuity engaged with China, whether or not we want to, given how important, big China is in the world. So China is not North Korea to us, and I think it's important remembering that. So really what we're talking about is, what's the name of this panel? It's also, it's what the new type of engagement is going to look at, not whether or not we are engaged with China. I think the second is, I do feel like in a lot of the US policy discussions, the story is very much everything is China's fault on this. And I just think, again, as a historical reality, that's an insufficiently self-reflective view of the world. I bet the same sort of discussion is happening in Beijing policy making circles too, which is everything is America's fault. And if we're going to get to Coexistence 2.0, part of this will be a maturation of the discussion to where both sides can recognize to some extent, you know what, you actually have a point. So on peaceful evolution that John Foster Dulles mentioned in his Senate testimony, guess what? You can look through the records of US intelligence operations. We have been known on occasion to engage in some covert activity, maybe even regime change. I can imagine how China looks out at the world. It sees the United States as having not completely benign intentions and having a track record of doing some somewhat nefarious things. And I think to pretend like we don't have that on our balance sheet is just inaccurate. Now, again, my inverse point is not Beijing is right and we are now actively seeking to thwart or subvert China's regime. That's clearly not the case. If we were trying to subvert it, we've done a very, very, very bad job over the last 4 decades. But it is to say that I don't think we can deny the entirety of the hostile forces narrative in China, even if the party cranks it up to a 14 when it should probably be about a 4. And again, I think an inverse narrative is happening in Beijing, where Beijing is completely unable to see how it could have contributed to the deterioration of relations, and where its actions and some of the criticisms of the United States are in fact well justified. So our long-term coexistence 2.0 will have to be, again, some maturation on that. I think the final point is, I guess I differ on the Xi Jinping part of this equation because, first of all, things were heading south before, the 16th Party Congress 18th Party Congress in 2012. And in fact, I remember two essays, one by Henry Kissinger in 2011, which was his first were in the foothills of the Cold War essay, which he then dusted off and republished a couple of years ago. And then a really great essay by Yan Shuitong, the Chinese scholar, who said in 2010, things are really bad right now. And the only way they're going to get better is if we start being honest with each other about how bad things are. So I think part of this is it would be nice and an easy story if everything's galloping along, Xi Jinping comes to power, then it all goes off the cliff. But I think the reasons leading up to where we are today are multifaceted. They run in both directions, and they're not going to be resolved by Xi Jinping, choking on a dumpling tomorrow and someone else taking over for him as general secretary. I think we'd still very much be in the same position that we are. And then just very, very quickly on Xi after the 20th Party Congress. Now I'll switch over and put my rightist hat on. No, I mean, I think what I hope we don't do is overinterpret events of the past couple weeks. I hope we don't overinterpret the Biden-Xi meeting. Melanie can correct me on what the official line is, but we didn't solve anything on Monday. It was a very, very, very good first step. It's necessary, but not sufficient. All the distrust is still there. All the major issues we have to find resolutions on, technology, Taiwan, those are all sitting there still at the center of the relationship. And I also think there's a view in Washington, at least, that we came into the meeting with a stronger hand. We had the midterm elections, CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act. I fear that we're both looking at different scorecards here, because I bet Xi Jinping went into that meeting feeling pretty darn confident. And real estate market, COVID not aside, I think China looks at its position today and feels pretty good about it. And the bad analogy that I use is, I think we often look at China and see a terminal, patient with terminal cancer. And I think China right now sees itself as a bodybuilder with a cold. It is dealing with some economic headwinds. Almost all of these are bad policy decisions. Of course, the slowdown in China's major export markets is not China's fault, but COVID zero and its mishandling of the real estate sector are policy decisions. So I expect Beijing had really smart, sound reasons for going into the meeting with Biden. There's a dual strategy working at cross purposes here, where we both want to arrest the decline in the relationship for our own strategic benefit. I think China's view is it would very much like to level this off a little bit, because it has just seen a fairly unrelenting series of actions that have been coming out of the Biden administration. Again, many of these quite sound, but I think from Beijing's view, it would like to get in there with Biden, grab the joystick and the stick and pull up on this a little bit. But I think, we should be no under illusion that we're in a better position, because if, Speaker McCarthy takes a congressional delegation to Taiwan in April, we're back to August 6th again. And I don't think Xi Jinping has become less nationalist, less ambitious. To Orville's point, he's been in power for 10 years. We know what his view of the world is. It was laid out in the 20th Party Congress political report. That hasn't changed in the past couple of weeks. This is a very, very dark vision where he sees the next decade as defined by tension with the United States. So
thanks, Jude. So it's Bob's turn. And I'm going to ask Bob a question that both in this vein, but takes us toward looking to the future too. As you may recall, when I mentioned the titles of Bob's books, he uses the words power and security more than once in the titles of his book. So Bob, I want to ask you, from the viewpoint of promoting U.S. power and security, maybe global security, where should we situate ourselves in terms of what a principled engagement might constitute? Is not exporting certain kinds of semiconductor technology to China promoting our power and security? Or conversely, does it incentivize the Chinese to try to develop the same more quickly and therefore not? I mean, what's your take on this? Power and security, Bob Ross.
Thanks, Bill. I promise to get to your questions after a long introduction. First, I want to sort of say, what does the US face? What's the challenge? And Taylor Fravel mentioned earlier that China's doing what you would expect any country to do. After all, since World War II, the US had bases in Korea, Japan, Philippines, de facto bases in Singapore surrounding China, and created basically an American lake in the South China Sea where US naval vessels could go up to Chinese territorial waters, sometimes in them with impunity. No rising power would accept that. We would expect China to push back. And this is what China's doing. So and relatively speaking, the terms aggressive and belligerent don't apply because relatively speaking to TR with the speak softly and carry a big stick, China looks like a peacenik of the 1960s and 70s. It hasn't engaged its navy, it hasn't gone into ports, it hasn't overthrown governments. So it's doing what it's expecting any rising power to do in a way that is less belligerent than perhaps depicted in Washington. And it's been, we must say, quite successful. We've heard terms about backlash and so forth. We have an expression in English, in America, we say no pain, no gain. So that if China wasn't out there exercising its power and making people nervous, you wouldn't have the countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia saying we're moving toward equidistance, we don't want to take sides. They didn't say it 10 years ago. 2014 major defense agreement with the Philippines. 10 years ago, we were using Malaysia for anti-submarine warfare activities in South China Sea. 10 years ago, we put missile defense in South Korea. We don't do that anymore. These countries are adjusting to the rise of China, and China's throwing its weight around a little bit by distancing themselves from the United States. Also, we should just keep in mind that China is successful, still successful in economic growth. Our headlines bemoan the state of the American economy. They talk about the state of the Chinese economy, but they don't put the two together. So if Arthur is right that China grows at 4% a year, they'll still grow faster than we will. And at 4% a year faster than us, the incremental growth in their defense budget, their aid budget, and so forth will be greater than the US. So the trend is still not good in the United States. We're losing in East Asia. There's nothing the US can do to offset the naval balance. The Chinese naval spending is just killing the United States, and there's nothing we can do. The US Navy requested a 39 ship reduction in ships in service for next year. 39 ships gone in 1 year. That's what they've requested. Chinese are adding more ships every year. So what's our response? Well, we are determined to not allow China to be number one, period. And you can see that in National Security Council Sullivan's speech on technology. The United States must dominate global high technology because that will enable us to maintain military dominance. All this technology that we're worried about, he made clear it's the military spillover. Second, what are we doing? The National Strategy Report, we must dominate the world order and not allow China to influence the world order. And dominates everywhere, superiority is everywhere, and perhaps in all but name. So how is the US doing this? We're waging a trade war. This is a Donald Trump trade war, but the Biden administration has continued it, despite Janet Yellen's insistence that it has no strategic value and it contributes to inflation, no matter how small or how large. She said, since it contributes to inflation, we should try and mitigate the trade war. She lost that war. Catherine Tai won that battle, and the Biden administration has not shown any inclination to reduce the trade war. We now have a tech war. We now have an ideology war. We have up-tempo naval exercises in the South China Sea and up-tempo naval presence in the Taiwan Strait. We have a Taiwan policy that's changed. This is all an effort to resist the rise of China to maintain America's number one. So let's be clear, the costs to America are very high on this. At the security level, we have no cooperation with China and North Korea, no Chinese cooperation with America and Iran, and we are now have a greater risk of war with a major power, with a major naval power over Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's a high cost. Second, the cost of the American economy. The trade war is expensive. It does contribute to inflation. The Secretary of the Treasury ought to know. And it's going to impact American technological development as we pursue decoupling in technology. There's also a cost to American civil liberties. Let's be clear that the changes in American foreign policy toward China have contributed to the FBI activities. And the FBI has shown no inclination to set this back. Just the other day, the head of the FBI's testimony before Congress made clear that he sees China's intelligence threat to America as great as ever, and counterintelligence against Americans and Chinese coming into America remains very high despite that. And of course, we've seen an uptick in racism, which we can expect to continue should the US-China conflict grow. This has been an expensive policy on the part of the United States. So it's a gamble. Let's say that it's a gamble. It's a gamble in two respects. We are trying to defeat the rise of China so America can be number one. And you can see it in NSC Sullivan's comments. You can see it in the National Security Strategy Report. That is our objective. So first, it's a gamble because you better damn well win. Otherwise, you pay a lot if you don't win. And two, it better be worth winning, even if you do win. And that's where I want to get to Bill's point. What could we do different? Well, it's never been part of American security policy since day one that America has to be number one in the world. We found ourselves in that position in 1991 or 1989, and we like it, and we want to keep it. But we already have, if you will, number one with no competitor in the Western Hemisphere, which makes us one of the most secure countries in the history of the world. And we've never defined American superiority in Europe as necessary, only that the Soviet Union couldn't have superiority. And we never defined our Asian interests as being superior in Asia, only that another country could. So the first step forward, Bill, would be to accept bipolarity. And you accept bipolarity by acknowledging how strong America is. It's not about to be eclipsed by Chinese hegemony. We can be confident in that. You accept bipolarity by saying the United States remains dominant in the Western Hemisphere, the greatest security, perhaps, a country in history, and then you compete. And then you're able to compete surgically. And as I say, well, not all technology, but the way Europe is doing it, Japan is doing it, say this particular company, that particular company, but for the most part, you can maintain cooperation technology. In trade, well, certainly we can walk back trade where it hurts Americans and try and ease it. The Chinese have sent no signal that they're prepared to reciprocate, but we don't know what they will do if we take first steps. And as Janet Yellen said, it's in American interest to take the first steps. So that would mean trade. In Asia, I mean, let's be clear. We have fundamentally changed our Taiwan policy where no member of the CIA, State Department, DOD says China has the capability to occupy Taiwan. They basically say 2027 is when they may have an amphibious capability, which tells us that their capability vis-a-vis Taiwan hasn't changed in 15 years. Basically, since 2005, they've had the same missile capability, the same submarine capability, the same air capability, and no ability to land. Now, the American US-China naval balance has improved, but their ability to do a landing, no, nothing has changed. But so the threat to Taiwan has not changed. What our Taiwan policy is. So we are all deterrents all the time on Taiwan. If you want to avoid a war, well, I do believe you can negotiate. After all, we have negotiated.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks, Bob. So I know that some of our panelists would like to respond to each other, but what I think I'd like to do so as to bring the audience in is now our part, bring the audience in for questions and reserve maybe the last 10 minutes for each of our panelists to not only respond, but look to the future as to what we might hope for, wish for, want, build for, need to avoid. So let's, okay,
Yeah.
questions.
Okay.
And please indicate who you are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, has the Communist Party in China?
Your name is?
Oh, Sandy Singer, I'm a local lawyer. Has the Communist Party in China ever had a woman chair? Is it possible? Is it cultural, or is it just not happen? And one of the reasons I'm wondering is, I think 50% Kamala Harris is going to be the next president. And is there a Chinese counterpart? And maybe sisterhood doesn't have the macho, and maybe there can be some coexistence.
Thank you. Who would like to take that? Jude as the of the party?
No, there's never been a general secretary or leader of the Communist Party who's been a woman, and there's actually been a retrogress. This year, after the 20th Party Congress, there has traditionally been at least one, at the most two on the Politburo. There are now no women on the now 24-member Politburo. And actually, the Communist Party puts out statistics every year on demographics of the Communist Party. And women have always been a strong minority within the Communist Party as a whole. So this is a deeply patriarchal structure of the Communist Party. And you can, I'm go off script here a minute, but you can see in how violently the party has been cracking down, especially on some of the protests that have been led by women over the past couple of years. And one of their deep frustrations is, of course, how could we ever expect any degree of representation of the issues that matter to us when this is at the top all men? I see no prospect ever that there will be a general secretary. The most that we could hope for is in the next party Congress, they reintroduce at least some female representation on the Politburo. Thank you. Our next questioner, your name, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mario Artaza from Chile. So given that we are a Pacific country, Chile is, my question is geared towards Latin America and facing the Pacific. The event at this moment tries to touch upon what should the US do. We're seeing that China is making great inroads in Latin America. Many Latin American countries today, in a decade, have turned to China as their #1 trading partner. We've seen countries like Panama, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua recognize the People's Republic of China and leaving behind its recognition of Taiwan. So given the fact that we're seeing this inroad by the People's Republic of China in Latin America, given the fact that Latin America is part of the American continent where the US is part of, what should the US do in Latin America in order to ascertain more dialogue, more interaction, more positive momentum when it comes also to China? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for that. I can tell you what we are seeking to do. And what we are seeking to do is deepen our economic relationship with our partners in Latin America and South America. So you saw the recent Americas Summit. We're now launching the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. One thing that COVID taught us is that we need more supply chain redundancy. When you look at friendshoring and nearshoring and opportunities for deeper economic partnerships that are geographically quite close, that is obviously where we turn to. So, we are working with Latin American nations on semiconductor supply chains, on energy issues. We're doing a lot to deepen our relationship there. And we recognize that the other nations that those nations deal with, that's their choice. We don't ask them to choose between the US and China. We just ask them to choose to do more with the United States and have more partnership with us. I think Bob had mentioned earlier that some countries are at times kind of resistant and fearful to doing I know you didn't put it this way, but there's definitely, what we hear from partners is China will punish us for our choice, but you don't. We want to maintain that, of course, but also create more space for nations to have choices. We want to provide choices, provide opportunities for deeper US partnership and have that attractive model. That's what we're seeking to do.
And Bob has a
Brief comment. We face an uphill battle on the one hand. The Chinese market's 4 to 5 times larger than the American market and growing, 50% faster, 75% faster, so that there will be more exports going to China, all other things being equal, than the United States. And what these countries tend to want is market access. And we have a difficult time in expanding our market access. Having said that, it's good for the people of Latin America. It raises their standard of living, investment's good. And I don't particularly feel much alarmed by it because the United States retains significant military capabilities. Bill mentioned I do security, I do. Significant military superiority. I remember Jesse Helms once got very, very upset because the Chinese got the maintenance contract for the Panama Canal, and that was 30 years ago, and it really didn't matter, right? Because American ships dominated the Panama Canal. So I'd like to do better, and and we should do better, and we should offer them more choice. But I don't think it's something we need to worry about.
Thank you. Our next speaker.
Thank you all for being here. This is Jason Xu, originally from Taiwan, currently a research fellow at Kennedy School. So in reflecting today's conference, it seems that the outlook for US and China relationship is pretty grim. And moving forward, if the political ideology take over reason or rationality, Taiwan could likely be or continue to be the receiving end of the impact of a US and China deteriorating relations. And let's say Kevin McCarthy took the Republican congressional delegation to Taiwan, and that would further provoke China's anger and aggression, and or a version of a Taiwan Policy Act which moved towards recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign state got passed in the Congress. So what advice you would give to Taiwan or Taiwanese government in thinking through the strategic move or room and space in order to create some possibilities so that we can shelter from the impact that's created because of the US and China competition? Thank you.
Thanks. Who would like to take that? Orville? Yeah.
One thought is that, we obviously don't want to do anything to unnecessarily provoke anybody and create conflict. It is conceivable that President Tsai in Taiwan could say to Kevin McCarthy, listen, we will welcome you here at some point. Let's use your trip as a way to see if we can't engage China first to yield somehow, or to make some sort of concession or get some sort of a dialogue going with us to see if we can't work this thing out before the trip, or maybe that would make it unnecessary for the trip to happen. Something like that, it would seem to me make sense. And she is in her last year. And this is the time when she could do something very bold and risk burning up a little political capital, perhaps with her own party.
Thanks, Earl. I can't help but note that in response to the previous question, there is a woman head of state in Taiwan. It is a Chinese society, so it suggests that culture is not all determinative. Our next questioner.
Hello, my name is Quay. I'm an engineer. I'm not associated with any Harvard, associated with any facility here. So my question, I hear from the panelists talking about the topic, what should the US do? So we heard a lot about trust. So how are we going to have a trust? So, lead by example, right? So Chinese people, I'm not talking about the leadership. Chinese people is very peaceful. The people were not interested in war. After 1949, after.
Again, question, if you have a question.
Okay, so China only have, after 1949, only involved two wars. One is Indian, above the border. Second is Vietnam. Well, the Vietnam War, I wouldn't say is a personal war, it's Deng Xiaoping's war. So other than that, China have not invaded anything out of the border. Taiwan, based on US and China relationship is based on when US and China built a relationship, 1972, recognize Taiwan is part of China.
Please ask a question.
So the question is, what should US do to earn the trust? That's my first question. The second question is.
Yeah, one question. Yeah, what should US do to earn trust?
Right.
Okay, thanks. Who would like to?
Maybe if I understand the question is about the US, but let me talk about maybe one thing both sides could do, the US and China. Of course, Taiwan has agency as well. It does make it hard to find an enduring solution when one side is threatening an invasion. And of course, as codified in China's 2005 anti-secession law, they hold out the prospect that if they're unsatisfied with the pace of developments, that they will use non-peaceful means to bring a final solution to the Taiwan question. So that, on the one hand, that's what makes it hard on one side to find a peaceful solution to this. And I think on all sides, people are, especially in Taiwan here in the United States, are strongly hoping that we can find some way to bring this to a successful and peaceful resolution. But it's hard, again, when one side is threatening an invasion. On the US side, I think we have as a responsibility, obviously, to reassure China. But frankly, reassurance right now is just consistency and clarity about our policy. So what I would like to see the US do is be more forceful in the clarity of its one China policy. And oftentimes the best thing the United States can do is nothing. In this case, a trip by Speaker McCarthy. There are challenges to what any administration can do with Congress, and that's one of the challenges of a democratic society is elected leaders are allowed to go visit other democratic polities. So I think that's one thing both can do is China should take much more significant steps to assure that it is not intending to use force to bring about a solution, and the United States should be clear and consistent on its one China policy.
Okay, thank you. Our next questioner.
Thank you so much. I'm a student from the Graduate School of Education, and now I'm also from China. So a lot of people believe
And
that Xi
your
Jinping
name is your name?
My name's Yan Liang.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So a lot of people believe that Xi Jinping is kind of conservative. He's not really an open person to the world. So when, after 20 years parties conference, something happened to the stock market in both in China and Hong Kong. But at the same time, German Chancellor Scholz has visited China to find more opportunities to invest. How do you think about these, the investing environment in the future in China? To what extent do you think it's different to the European investors and also to the US investors? Thank you.
Thank you. And who would like to take that?
So,
Well, I think to just in regard to Germany, Germany has a unique problem in that its auto industry has the China needle deeply in its arm, but they're not alone. And this speaks to what, Jude had suggested that we are deeply coupled, even as we may be in the process of some modest decoupling. I think that, one of two things will happen. We'll slowly readjust our supply lines, or something will happen as it did in the Ukraine and blow the whole thing to smithereens, and we're going to have to make the best of it. Industries tend to prefer the former.
Thank you. Our next questioner, please.
Hi, my name is Connor Bralla. I'm a graduate student at Tufts. I'm also a longtime resident of Shanghai. Kind of building off of two questions ago, what I'm kind of getting, I'm not sure I'm 100% correct here, but it seems like there's a sense that, at least from the US side, we're trying to reach out, we're trying to meet them halfway, and then China doesn't really do anything. I wonder, my question is there's anything that the US can do to kind of make the Chinese maybe a bit more comfortable or a bit more willing to reciprocate any US overtures in either in the political sphere or even just kind of person-to-person contact?
Maybe I'll ask Bob, since he was in the vein that we need to do better.
So we could take some unilateral steps to help the American economy by removing some sanctions. And that might elicit reciprocity. I don't know. If it doesn't, you at least help the American worker. There are things you can do on Taiwan. We've been about 10 transits a year through the Taiwan Strait. We could signal some moderation by cutting those in half. Congress won't notice, but Taiwan will and the mainland will. And I think also Jude's point's an important one. At this point, reassurance is doing nothing. And if we showed some restraint going forward, the Chinese may feel we've stabilized our Taiwan policy, and that could be helpful.
So Dinda, who's done a great job of organizing the day, reminds me just now that it's 10 minutes. I thought we started at 10 after. Don't we get 70 minutes? Oh.
Class 15.
Okay, so we'll take. Yeah, okay, great. So one more question, and then I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to look to the future. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Benjamin Gallant. I'm a PhD student here studying early China. Professor Graham Allison raised a question this morning that he said would be left for the afternoon, which is, given the reality of American politics, what can we do? And given kind of the structural economic factors that are influencing the rise of populism in the United States, what should we do about what the US should do? Thank you.
Maybe more, I could take that as the moderator. And so one of my pet peeves over the last 30 years has been that in general, American administrations have not been as forthright as they might be about the implications of engaging China. So here I'm focusing in particular on the Clinton administration, where the entry of China into the WTO was sold as a cure-all. China was going to converge, adopt rule of law, market economy, and perhaps even some form of liberal democracy. It would be relatively cost-free. Censorship is nailing Jell-O to a wall. So I feel administrations, Democratic or Republican, have an obligation to be straight with the people. I think Melanie is setting a good example here, to be straight about the implications of our policies so that there aren't later recriminations. Also, yes, as was said in an earlier panel, for I guess Yashang or somebody, I can't remember, goods are cheaper to buy, but there have also been a lot of social costs that have come from particularly hard-hit communities. So I teach trade, I believe in free trade, but I also believe in total candor about the implications of decisions taken. So I think that would not be a cure-all, but it would be an important initial step. And of course, what's good for the goose, as we say, is good for the gander. So ideally, it would be the same in China, right? So it would be less of a one-sided media that was censoring a great deal less, much more candor on the part of the government, much more room for free expression, academic freedom, and so forth. So I did promise, and Dinda was very nice to give me an extra 2 or 3 minutes there. I wanted to give our panelists each a chance to look to the future. And the way I would pose this is, I'd like to talk about what I call principled engagement or principled interaction, if you don't like the word. I started to teach a course called Engaging China with US Harvard Law School students, many actually from China, and Renmin University Law School in China. And the word Engaging China, we chose as title because it seemed kind of neutral. But I must say, over the 10 years, people began to assume it wasn't neutral. But whether we call it engagement or interaction or whatever, how in a principled way, given the realities that Jude and Orville and many others talked about, where we are bound together on certain issues, whether we like it or not, so as to avoid disaster, whether it's ecological disaster or a military disaster. What's your best advice for wise people here about how to, again, engage, interact, connect with China, but do it in a way that is consistent with our values and our interests as a society? That, namely, if it's simply an expedient interaction, it's not, seems to me, going to hold. So who would like to start with that? Okay, or
well, a quick thought. I think for me, that to arrive back at coexistence or a new form of engagement, I would need to know what kind of a scenario they would embrace. And I have not yet heard one that would work for both sides. I think one very practical thing might be for our president to call up Xi Jinping and say, I want to send a team of 3 or 4 people over to Beijing or some neutral country. You appoint a team, they'll sit there for a few days, they'll come up with a couple of scenarios that the 2 teams agree are possible off-ramps and roads forward. I would think that would be a constructive step that would lower the temperature.
And is there, may I ask, is there a role for civil society at all in promoting that?
I would think these should not be government officials.
Mhm.
They could be former government officials or other people in other walks of life who know something about China and US-China relations.
I remember many years ago, there was a meeting where a diplomat, US government official was giving a talk on North Korea. Members of the audience kept saying these suggestions on how to reach agreement with North Korea. And he said, well, those are all great suggestions. If only I can get North Korea to agree. And I think that's what our suggestions are for the Biden administration. We can all think of good things for the Biden administration to do, but getting them to accept them is a whole nother matter. And the reason I say that is quite clear the Biden administration likes the trade war. The Biden administration likes its tech war. It likes its Taiwan policy. It likes its up-tempo naval operations. It likes its ideological war. This is its policy. And I see no indications that it wants to mitigate that policy. It is competing. And they will say it again and again, they are competing. And the instruments of competition are trade war, tech war, ideology, Taiwan, naval exercise. I have all kinds of things that I think would be helpful. But I think we have to go forward and be pessimistic. That's saying the trend is what it is. And I fear that we are all deterrents all the time. We've heard American officials say today, negotiating with China isn't going to help. Xi Jinping is Xi Jinping and he is what he is and we got to deal with them. No, we can be strong, but we can talk and negotiate and seek compromise simultaneously. But that's not where we're at. I worry about Taiwan. Late 2023 to late 2025 are going to be a very difficult 2 years. You have a presidential campaign in Taiwan, and we all know that Democratic candidates tend to be irresponsible during campaigns. And so I worry what they will say and how the mainland will react. And then we're going to have a presidential campaign in the United States. And we all know, and I think the Republicans and Democrats will be tripping over each other to see who can be more pro-Taiwan and more anti-China. And then we're going to move into a post-election where the Chinese are going to gear up to make American politicians walk back what they said. The Americans are going to be in no mood to compromise because we're all about face and prestige and resolve and standing up to the rise of China. And China is far stronger than it used to be and will be less inclined to simply accept American policy. So I think going forward, I think we need to be pessimistic and we need to think, how can we curtail or constrain what current trends are by perhaps persuading Taiwan, as Orwell was suggesting, to be somewhat more forthcoming, have the United States do nothing, as Jude was saying, and altogether we may find ways to exercise some constraint.
Thank you. Well, it's fortuitous that Melanie is next in line.
Thank you. You know, we have to be precise. We are not pursuing war of all kinds.
Oh, I didn't
with
say
the
that.
PRC. Well, you listed about 5. So precision is important. So I'll give an example. In the semiconductor sector, you know, earlier someone mentioned the November 7th measures by the Biden administration. Those measures impact less than 1% of US semiconductor sales to China, less than 1%. They focus specifically on high-end chips, high-end manufacturing equipment, and supercomputing capabilities used for weapons of mass destruction, China's military modernization, and mass surveillance in Xinjiang. It is our duty to the American people and to global stability to make sure that we are not selling equipment to fuel weapons of mass destruction, mass surveillance, and China's military modernization. Less than 1% of US semiconductor sales to China. Precision matters. Less than 1% is not a tech war. You know, our aim, the end state we want, is not to contain China or contain China's rise. We do not, we welcome China to develop economically, to have flourishing exchange with the United States in ways that are on a level playing field, that don't undermine US national interests or universal values. And I think that the President Biden's approach to the meeting with President Xi is a perfect example of a principled approach to China. It is showing up and doing the meeting, not being afraid to stand up for our values, stand up for our interests, stand up for the international order, stand strong with our allies and partners, be frank and open about our interests and our principles, and also welcome collaboration. Welcome collaboration on climate change, on food security, on these common issues. And also, we are being very intentional about recognizing intense competition requires intense diplomacy. My door is open to Chinese counterparts. I have not denied a single meeting. Unfortunately, I only get to see the Chinese embassy because due to China's zero COVID policies, we don't have officials coming over from Beijing, but I have a lot of meetings with the Chinese embassy. I have an open door policy. President Biden just met with President Xi. My boss, Secretary Blinken, is planning a trip to China, maybe he'll do some form of the exercise that you recommended. We are taking a responsible approach to the American people and US-China relations. That does not include, it would not be a principled approach if we did what it sounds like you're suggesting, which is give up on human rights, move back from, critical actions of deterrence, drop actions that are critical for our economy, close our eyes, cross our fingers, and hope for the best. That's not, the responsible approach. So I think we are taking a principled approach.
Thanks, Melanie. And Jude, you wrap it up for everyone.
I'll be very, very quick. I just two things that I can think of. One is for a lot of folks who are frustrated with where US policy is, I'd start from the position that folks in previous administrations, this administration, are basically trying to take a period where there was not really good self-policing across various industries, sectors, technologies, and trying to think of solutions. And I think if you talk to any of them, they'll say they're doing some of it better, some of it worse. What I think would help is for folks really frustrated, come up with solutions. And we were over at MIT yesterday and they came up with that China strategy group came out with their report on how the university is going to engage with China. And we had a discussion about that yesterday. And I think that's where we should all be, is where you're frustrated, come up with a better mousetrap. Because oftentimes it's not the case that there's, rabid ideologues running around the Biden administration trying to smash China. It's just they're trying to get us up to speed, protect their understanding of national security imperfectly. So whatever we can do to plug in and give them better mousetraps. And then I think for folks who are all in on Smash China, and there are folks not here, but there are folks in DC on that, I think that the great challenge would be to remember the humanity of all of this. And go from this abstract notion of the party or China, and that happens both ways, by the way, of the United States is just Trump. And really remember that we're talking about profound issues of human dignity, of trying to find a world where there's robust human flourishing. Now, a lot of that will bring us into contention over issues like values and how we want order structured. But nonetheless, I think we oftentimes so abstract. And so when you say you want China's economy to slow, what you're really saying is you want sort of cognitive delays in child development, right? You want all the profound negative effects that come with slower growth. So I think just centering that in our head of, even if we have to make tough decisions, which you do in policy making, you're fundamentally talking about human beings and their lives and dignity.
Wow, I'm glad Jude got the wrap up there. To remember the human dimension. Thank the panelists. Thank you all.